At this moment, in Ohio, there is a 55-year-old woman, let's call her Linda, who has done everything right when it comes to managing her finances. She has consistently contributed the maximum to her 401k retirement account for 23 consecutive years. She drives a used car. She brings her own lunch. She gives up vacation pleasures. She watched her account balance grow from 5 digits to 6 digits. And eventually, it reached a level slightly above $700,000. And last Tuesday, for the first time in her life, Linda sat down and had a face-to-face meeting with a financial advisor. What the advisor told her made her feel a jolt of fear. $700,000. This is a figure that most Americans want to even see in a single account throughout their lifetime. However, this amount is not enough. Now, before you rush to turn off the video and think that is her problem, it has nothing to do with me. Let me show you something. Because the mathematical logic that shattered Linda's retirement dream is also closing in on almost everyone watching this video. And most of you haven't even noticed its existence. The truth is a little-known fact. We have been domesticated by banks, various apps, and those small retirement calculators on Fidelity's website. We are guided to chase a specific number. A huge, complete, and shiny number. $1 million. $2 million. No matter what the target is, you are told that as long as you reach this number, you are completely set for good. However, this thinking framework is actually a trap. I mean, a literal trap. Its design intention is to make you believe an illusion that the stage of accumulating wealth is the most difficult part, and everything after that is just smooth sailing, enjoying the fruits of your labor. But that is not the case. Let's turn our attention back to Linda, $700,000. It sounds like a huge sum, but Linda is 55 years old this year. She plans to retire at 62. The average life expectancy for American women is approximately 79 years. However, if you can live in good health until 62, according to actuarial tables, you have a high probability of living to 85 or even 87. Therefore, for safety's sake, let's plan for a retirement period of 25 years. $700,000 divided by 25 years. This means the disposable amount each year is only $28,000. This is before taxes and without deducting healthcare costs, before inflation erodes it year after year. $28,000. This is even below the federal poverty line for a family of 4. And Linda is single. Yes, she does receive Social Security benefits. Currently, in 2025, the average benefit is approximately $1,907 per month, equivalent to about $22,800 per year. So in total, Linda's annual gross income after retirement is approximately $50,800. This sounds like it is enough to make ends meet. Right, maybe, as long as no unexpected events occur. As long as prices don't rise. As long as her property tax doesn't increase. As long as she never needs surgery. As long as her car can keep running forever without breaking down. If, too many ifs. But the real question is Linda didn't do anything wrong. For over 2 decades, she has been actively saving. She lives within her means, leads a frugal life. She strictly followed the principles taught in every personal finance book. However, the current system still leaves her in a situation of financial shortage. Why? Because saving money and creating wealth are completely different things, belonging to 2 entirely different games. And most Americans have only learned how to play one of these games. Let me give you a number that will make you feel uneasy. The personal savings rate in the United States. That is, the proportion of disposable income that Americans save, dropped to 3.9% by the end of 2024. Just 3.9%. This is definitely not a mistake. For reference, in the early 1970s, this figure was above 12%. By the mid-2000s, just before the financial crisis, it had dropped to around 3%. In 2020 and 2021, with the distribution of pandemic relief funds, the savings rate briefly soared to above 30%. At that time, people were forced to stay at home and had no place to spend money. But then it plummeted back to the original level, in a cliff-like manner. So, where did all this money go? Well, let's take a look at how the income of an average American household is distributed, according to the data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. About 33% of the pre-tax income of an average household is spent on housing. Another 16 to 17% is spent on transportation. Healthcare and insurance expenses consume about 8% of the income. Food expenses account for another 12 to 13%. And there is also a hidden killer: debt repayment expenses. In the fourth quarter of 2024, the total debt of American households exceeded $18 trillion just for the outstanding balance of credit cards alone. It has soared to over $1.2 trillion. Currently, the average interest rate on credit cards is hovering at a high level of 22 to 23%. The balance of auto loans has exceeded $1.6 trillion, and the average monthly payment for purchasing a new car is as high as over $730. Therefore, when someone casually says, "All we need to do is save more money, and that'll do it," the real issue emerges: what is there to save? After covering expenses such as housing, transportation, food, insurance, and debt repayment, the financial situation of most families is already stretched to the limit and has very little left. That 3.9% savings rate is not due to laziness, but a pure mathematical fact. However, the truly sinister aspect lies precisely here. Even those who are actually saving money, that is, people like Linda, are actually engaged in a tough battle that they themselves do not fully understand, because the actual value of the funds they have saved is constantly being eroded invisibly. Let me explain this in detail. The inflation in 2022 and 2023 was felt by everyone directly. Depending on the type of goods purchased, grocery bills rose by 20%, 30%, or even sometimes as high as 40%. Rent prices soared. As for car insurance, speaking of car insurance, it is truly beyond ridicule. In some states, car insurance premiums skyrocketed by 40 to 50% in just 1 year. However, the official CPI data presented a completely different picture. By the end of 2024, the overall CPI index had dropped to around 2.7% to 2.9%. The Federal Reserve also signaled that inflation was moving closer to the target level. Major media headlines were all abuzz with this, but this has made many people feel as if they have been subjected to some kind of gaslighting, because although the rate of price increase has slowed down, the prices of goods themselves have not dropped. The mechanism of inflation does not work like that, and most people have never truly understood and internalized this difference. Let me illustrate this with a specific example. Suppose your monthly grocery expenses in January 2020 were $600, and during the subsequent inflationary period, this expense increased by approximately 25%. So now, your monthly expenditure has risen to around $750. When the inflation rate reverts to 3%, it doesn't mean that your grocery prices will return to $600. The actual meaning is the price will increase from $750 to $772. Next year, it will rise to $795, and the year after that, it will reach $819. The baseline for prices has been permanently reset. And precisely this point completely disrupted people's retirement planning. Take Linda as an example. Do you remember her? She conducted a retirement financial assessment in 2018. At that time, she assumed an inflation rate of 2%, which seemed a reasonable estimate. After all, for the entire decade prior to that, the inflation rate had remained at a low level and fluctuated smoothly. According to her plan, if she wanted to lead a comfortable retirement life, she needed to save $650,000, but her current savings amount to $700,000. Logically speaking, she should have already exceeded the set goal. However, the sudden inflation outbreak that occurred between 2021 and 2023 completely reevaluated her future financial prospects. Now, the various living expenses she has estimated are 15 to 20% higher than the assumptions in her initial plan, and these increased prices will continue to accumulate and affect future expenditures. The $700,000 she currently has, its actual purchasing power has been reduced to approximately $580,000, measured against the cost of living assumptions she used in her original assessment. She did not lose the face value of the money. What she lost was the purchasing power of the money. In the end, these two are actually the same thing. This situation is now affecting everyone who saves in the form of nominal currency. In other words, almost everyone is caught in it. Your bank account shows one figure, while the prices on the supermarket shelves tell a completely different story. And the difference between these two figures is the invisible tax that you have never voted to approve. Now, there is a question that almost no one asks. If inflation is causing such severe harm to savers, then who exactly is benefiting from it? The answer is the borrowers. Specifically, it refers to individuals or institutions that had already taken on fixed-rate debts before the inflation hit. If you locked in a 3% mortgage rate in 2020, but the inflation rate in the following years was as high as 6 to 7%, then you were actually repaying the loan with devalued money. While the actual cost of your debt decreased, the actual value of your savings was shrinking. This is precisely the reason why the wealthy tend to maintain high levels of debt. They are well aware that in an environment of inflation, cash is like a piece of melting ice, while debt, if structured properly, is actually an asset. This understanding is not something that most salaried depositors can naturally grasp intuitively, because they have been taught since childhood that all debt is bad and savings accounts are the safe haven. However, both of those statements are too one-sided and simplistic. It is precisely this narrow perspective that has caused countless ordinary people to pay a heavy price throughout their lives. All right. Now let's talk about the number one expense that could completely derail the retirement plan. It is not the housing expense, nor is it the general inflation, but rather the healthcare costs. Fidelity releases a report every year to estimate how much a typical retired couple would need to spend on healthcare during their retirement. Note that this does not include long-term care costs, but only the pure medical expenses. What was the estimate for 2024? It was as high as $315,000. This is the amount required for a couple, and it is still the expense they would need to cover even after enjoying the benefits of Medicare. Let me emphasize once again, even after Medicare becomes fully operational and provides coverage, you are expected to bear up to $315,000 in medical expenses throughout your retirement period. This amount includes Medicare premiums, supplementary insurance premiums, copayments for outpatient services, prescription drug costs, dental care fees, vision care expenses. In short, all those items that Medicare cannot fully cover or does not reimburse at all. As for the cost of long-term care, that is an entirely different financial disaster. Currently, in American nursing homes, the average cost for a single room is over $110,000 per year, and the average cost for hiring a home healthcare assistant varies from state to state, ranging from about $60,000 to $75,000 per year. Here is a set of data that will keep you awake at night. Today, approximately 70% of people over the age of 65 will need some form of long-term care for the rest of their lives. That means 7 out of 10 people. Medicare does not cover long-term care expenses. Let me repeat this loudly so that the audience in the back can also hear clearly. Medicare does not cover long-term care expenses. The federal Medicaid program does cover this expense, but only if you have exhausted almost all of your assets. Essentially, you must first become completely destitute before the government will step in to provide assistance. Therefore, a person with no savings at all and a person who has saved $500,000 will eventually end up in the same government-funded nursing facility. The only difference is that the thrifty saver must first spend away all of his life savings. This is by no means a hypothetical scenario. This scene is unfolding right now, in the present. Every day, in every state of this country, those ordinary people who have been conscientious and saved for 30 or 40 years are now watching helplessly as their lifelong efforts are completely wiped out by the medical system within just a few months. Moreover, medical costs are accelerating their rise. For decades, the rate of medical inflation has consistently been higher than the overall inflation rate. Drug prices have continued to increase. Mergers and integrations among hospitals have weakened market competition, thereby further driving up medical costs. Insurance companies are also aggressively raising premiums. In 2024, in many regional markets, health insurance costs have seen double-digit growth. Have you taken this factor into account? Most people haven't. Most online retirement calculators do not model healthcare costs separately from general inflation. They often only assume a fixed annual expenditure, and this assumption simply cannot accurately reflect the real situation. This is precisely where the retirement plan ultimately fails. Not in the stock market, nor due to poor investments, but in the doctor's office. Now, let's talk about that obvious, yet often overlooked problem: Social Security. Approximately 40% of Americans age 65 and above rely on Social Security to provide at least half of their income. For about 14% of elderly beneficiaries, this is basically their sole source of income. For these people, Social Security is by no means merely a complementary program. It is their core program on which they depend for survival. However, its trust fund is facing depletion. According to the latest forecast by the Social Security Board of Trustees, the combined old age and survivors insurance trust fund will be depleted around 2033 to 2035. There are less than 10 years left until that point. The depletion of the trust fund does not mean that Social Security benefits will be zeroed out, because payroll tax revenues will continue to flow in. But by then, the system will only be able to actually pay out approximately 77 to 80 cents for every dollar of the obligation. In other words, if your expected benefit payment is $2,400 per month. The actual amount you receive might be around $1,900. This means a reduction of $500 in monthly income, which amounts to $6,000 for the entire year. For someone with an annual total income of only between $30,000 and $40,000, this is definitely not a negligible rounding error. This difference is sufficient to determine whether they can maintain their basic living expenses or will fall into an unsustainable situation. So, will Congress really allow this to happen? Probably not in a straightforward, obvious way. More likely, scenarios might include the following. They might raise the cap on the amount of income subject to payroll taxes. Currently, any income above $168,600 is exempt from Social Security taxes, and there is growing political pressure to change this. They could gradually raise the full retirement age. For those born after 1960, this age is currently set at 67. They could conduct means testing of benefits, which essentially means that the benefits received by high-income retirees would be reduced. Or they could combine all of these options in some way, implementing them gradually over a long period of time, so that none of the individual changes appears to be devastating. But all these proposals have one thing in common, no matter how it is carried out. Each plan means that the amount of money you ultimately receive will be less than what was originally promised. This reduction can be achieved directly by cutting benefits or indirectly by raising taxes. That is, after the benefits are distributed, a portion of them is recovered through tax measures. If your retirement planning heavily relies on the Social Security system, then you are actually building upon a foundation that the Washington authorities themselves have already admitted is showing signs of cracking. This is not some conspiracy theory. The relevant facts are clearly stated in the trustee reports and are also clearly published on the official website of the Social Security Administration. However, millions of Americans are actually doing the opposite. They are formulating retirement plans based on a promise that, according to the government's own admission, cannot be fulfilled in its current form. All right. During these past 17 minutes, I have mainly been explaining to you why, for the vast majority of people, the traditional saving model is bound to be a losing game. So, how should we deal with it? What practical actions should we take? I will never sit here and try to sell you any courses, nor will I encourage you to invest in cryptocurrencies, nor will I peddle that unrealistic passive income fantasy to you. What I really want to do is help you understand a set of thinking frameworks. Precisely, these frameworks will distinguish those who can enjoy their later years with no worries from those who eventually run out of money and savings. And the core of this framework, boiled down to its essence, is 3 structural changes. The first transformation is from simply saving to creating cash flow. Simply accumulating a large sum of money is fundamentally different from establishing a system that can consistently generate income. A large sum of money is ultimately limited. You will gradually deplete it. Every withdrawal makes it smaller. With each passing year of life, this amount gets closer to zero. However, cash flow is quite different. It can come from dividend-paying stocks, rental income from properties, small businesses or side projects that generate revenue with minimal effort, a laddered bond portfolio, or certain structured annuity products. Although when it comes to annuities, you must be extremely cautious. Our goal is not merely to have a large number. The real goal is to establish a mechanism that can consistently generate monthly income. This income should be sufficient to cover your daily expenses without depleting your principal. Or even if there is a depletion, the rate of consumption should be extremely slow. This is what financial planners often refer to as the 4% rule. Although this rule is currently under strict scrutiny, in the current interest rate and inflation environment, some researchers now advocate that for the future, a 3.3% or even 3% withdrawal rate would be a more secure option. However, the core principle remains the same. You should make the funds work for you, enabling them to generate income rather than simply leaving them idle in the account, waiting to be spent. The second transformation lies in understanding, truly comprehending the tax issues related to retirement. Most people take it for granted that their tax burden will decrease after retirement. For some, this is indeed the case. However, for a significant number of retirees, their actual tax burden is much higher than expected. The reason for this is that they have almost entirely deposited all their savings into deferred tax accounts, such as traditional 401k plans and traditional IRA accounts. Any funds withdrawn from a traditional 401k account will be taxed as ordinary income for each dollar once you reach the age of 73, which is the current required minimum distribution age set by the IRS. The IRS will mandate that you start withdrawing funds from the account, whether you actually need this money or not. Moreover, these mandatory distributions may push you into a higher tax bracket, resulting in your Social Security benefits being subject to taxation and your health insurance premiums being increased through the Mama mechanism. This is why Roth conversions have become such a hot topic. Converting funds from traditional pre-tax accounts to Roth accounts, that is, paying taxes now to ensure that future withdrawals are completely tax-free, can be a very powerful strategy, especially in years when your income is low, such as during the transition period after retirement, but before Social Security benefits and required minimum distributions have started. This strategy is particularly effective, but it requires careful planning, strategic vision, and must be initiated several years before you actually need the money. If you are currently in your 40s or 50s, but haven't yet had a detailed discussion with a tax-savvy financial planner regarding your Roth conversion strategy, then you may be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table over your lifetime. The third transformation is this: you must confront your actual life expectancy and plan for the worst-case scenario, rather than the average scenario. Using average life expectancy as the planning basis is actually an extremely poor approach. After all, half of the population will live longer than the average life expectancy. If you plan to die at the age of 82, but actually live to 94, then you will face a funding gap period of 12 years. This is far from a peaceful old age. It is a complete crisis. Therefore, set your goal to live to the age of 95. If your family has a gene for longevity, you should even aim to live to 100. Yes, this means you need to save more money. It also means you might need to extend your working years, be more proactive in saving, or invest with more thought and wisdom. But if you don't do this, you will face another disastrous outcome: running out of all your savings at the age of 88 and being unable to return to work due to poor health. Facing such a serious consequence, overpreparation is actually the only rational and sensible response. This point is also closely related to the healthcare topic we discussed earlier. The long-term care expenses I mentioned earlier usually peak in the last 5 to 10 years of one's life. And this is precisely the period when you have the least savings and are most vulnerable. If you haven't made plans for this in advance, whether through purchasing long-term care insurance, hybrid life insurance, or simply setting up a dedicated reserve fund, then you are gambling with your most vulnerable and helpless later years of life. Now, let's bring the discussion back to its starting point and make a summary. Linda strictly followed all the suggestions given by others. She worked hard to save money and was willing to make sacrifices. Over the decades, she watched as the balance in her account kept increasing. However, she still faced the problem of a shortage of funds. This was not because of her own incompetence or failure, but because the rules of the game around her had undergone a huge change, and no one informed her of this change. Inflation has reshaped her expectations for her future finances. The soaring cost of healthcare has far exceeded any predictions she made in the spreadsheet. The Social Security system she had placed great hopes in, the pillar that was supposed to provide her with a safety net, has failed to fulfill its original promises in the mathematical model. Moreover, the savings she originally set aside for deferred taxation now come with a heavy tax burden that she never anticipated when making the withdrawal. This is by no means a personal failure of Linda. It reflects a huge systemic gap between financial education in the United States and the actual functioning of the economy. We were taught from a young age to save, and saving is indeed a good thing. I will never deny that. However, in a society rife with inflation, high taxes, and a social system that can push people into poverty due to illness, merely relying on savings is like futilely pumping water out of a boat with a hole in it without ever thinking about repairing that hole. If you are watching this video and you are in your 20s or 30s, then congratulations, you possess the most valuable asset: time. Please make sure to make the best use of it. Start building assets that can generate a steady stream of income. Take advantage of your current relatively low income and contribute the maximum amount to your Roth IRA. Thoroughly study the tax laws. Not because the tax laws are particularly fascinating, but because they are the most powerful and effective legal tool in the process of wealth accumulation in this country. If you are in your mid-40s or early 50s, it is not too late to take action now, but the margin for error you have left is very limited. Every decision you make in the next 5 to 10 years will directly determine the quality of your life in the last 30 years. Please formulate a detailed and specific plan. Seek professional financial advice, and do not make hasty guesses or act blindly. And if you are already in retirement but still feel overwhelmed by financial pressure, remember, you are not alone. Millions of Americans are facing the same predicament as you. In fact, there are many effective strategies that can significantly improve your situation, such as optimizing the timing of Social Security benefits, Roth conversions, formulating a comprehensive Medicare plan, reducing living expenses through downsizing strategies, and using the tax loss harvesting strategy, among others. But the prerequisite is that you must actively explore and discover these strategies. They will not come to you automatically. Every penny you have painstakingly saved is real and has actual value and significance. However, in a world where inflation is spreading continuously, if your funds are merely in a static, idle state, it actually means that your wealth is constantly shrinking and declining. The key issue is not how much money you have saved, but whether the wealth you have accumulated is sufficient to support you throughout your remaining life and maintain a decent quality of life. For the vast majority of Americans, if one were to give the most honest and straightforward answer, it would be this: without a more comprehensive and well-rounded financial plan, the current savings alone would be far from sufficient.